Don't believe what they tell you. We all knew that we were not being told the whole truth about Afghanistan, even as the war was still going on. We are being lied to about U.S. involvement in foreign campaigns over and over and over again. And there's nothing unpatriotic about asking for the truth.
This is The Reason interview with Nick Gillespie. Lasting 20 years, the war in Afghanistan was not only the longest conflict in American history, it was a near total failure from virtually any perspective. My guest today is filmmaker Dan Krauss, whose documentary Bodyguard of Lies is an unflinching look at U.S. involvement in Afghanistan and the lessons we desperately need to learn. Krauss shows how from the very beginning, officials like Donald Rumsfeld admitted they weren't going to be honest with the American people. We're reminded that within 6 months of 9/11, the U.S. had essentially destroyed al-Qaeda's capacity to attack us. But instead of leaving, Washington chose 2 more decades of occupation, nation building, strategic confusion, and widespread corruption. We get into how Presidents Bush and Obama kept doubling down, how trillions of dollars and thousands of lives were wasted, and how a compliant press and Congress let it all happen. Bodyguard of Lies is a chilling case study in hubris, deceit, and blowback. Here is The Reason interview with Dan Krauss. Dan Krauss, thanks for talking to Reason.
Thanks for having me.
So the documentary is about the Afghanistan War, America's longest war, and it's already one of America's most forgotten wars. I want to start with the question because this leads to a discussion of a very particular person who is front and center throughout the Afghanistan War, who is Donald Rumsfeld. But the title is called Bodyguard of Lies. Can you explain where that phrase comes from and why it is the controlling metaphor and title of the documentary?
Yeah, sure. Bodyguard of Lies comes from a Winston Churchill quote. And Churchill said, back in World War II, he said that the truth must always be attended by bodyguard of lies, with, the intention of communicating to the American public that sometimes the U.S. military can't be as forthright as perhaps they should be in times of war because they need to protect secrets. He was talking about the invasion date in Europe and how that needed to be protected by a bodyguard of lies. But it was sort of appropriated somewhat cynically, I think, by Donald Rumsfeld during the Afghanistan War to kind of protect the Defense Department from any kind of sense that they were not being forthright about the Afghanistan affair with the American public. So I think it wasn't used in quite the same way some 40 or 50 years later than when Churchill originally used it.
Yeah, and I mean, Churchill was talking about Operation Bodyguard, which was a deception the Allies were using to throw the Germans off where the invasion of France was going to be. And then you have this remarkable, and really one of the, I guess, achievements of the documentary is merely to remind us of the press conferences and of, the public discussion of Afghanistan from people like President George W. Bush, President Barack Obama, and especially Donald Rumsfeld, who was the defense secretary who beguiled the press corps. He was smart, he was funny, he would be exasperated. He was an incredible performer. But in this passage, he's basically going on, and he's telling people, and you have a Washington Post reporter who sums up what we just watched and say, and he was basically telling us, of course, the Pentagon is going to be lying to us throughout this.
Exactly. Yeah. No, I think Rumsfeld was, a wonderfully charming, Secretary of Defense, and he had a very, he was very skilled as an orator, and he was very adept at sort of squirming out of difficult questions. And you see that in this press conference. I mean, he starts off that moment of talking about Churchill and Bodyguard of Lies by saying, I don't want to be quoted on this. So he's savvy in that way. And he knew that kind of the idea of protecting truth with lies might be used against him. So he asked specifically not to be quoted. And, I think it was a really telling moment, as you say, and as Craig Whitlock, the Washington Post reporter that's in the film and who's, the originator of this reporting, as he tells it, that Rumsfeld was quite aware of what he was communicating, and that he knew that there's no possibility that the Defense Department was going to be completely honest and straightforward with the American public about Afghanistan. And this was his way of tacitly acknowledging that, or maybe explicitly acknowledging that.
Take us back a little bit to the time, while I was watching this, I'm 62. So I was an adult. I was the editor-in-chief of Reason magazine when 9/11 happened, and when we invaded Afghanistan in October 2001. And we were, and I was certainly, I'm generally a non-interventionist, and I was terrified by both first by the attacks. But then, what immediately became clear was going to be the response, which was going to be the global war on terror, the passage of the Patriot Act, and a virtually unanimous consensus, it seemed, not just among voters and among politicians, but among the media, that, this was a righteous war. Can you take us back to what it was like in, the invasion of Afghanistan in October? And then you have another Rumsfeld quote. He was famous for these memos that were called snowflakes because he promulgated so many of them. I mean, there were thousands and thousands of these. But by April 2002, he was saying, we don't know, what's our exit strategy here? How do we get out of here? Can you talk about, what was the consensus around in the press corps, in the country, of no, this is a just war, and not only that, it is going to be a successful war?
I mean, I was a young man at that time, and I certainly remember feeling that way, and maybe that was partly because I was a young man and stupid. Yeah. But I remember feeling this kind of palpable sense of anger, and really cheering on. I was not necessarily a supporter of George Bush and the Bush administration, but I certainly remember cheering on the idea that we were going to go after these bastards and bring them down and get the people that were responsible for 9/11. So I certainly remember that feeling. I remember seeing American flags. I live here in Oakland, California, the Bay Area. Even here in this kind of liberal bastion, there were American flags everywhere, every car.
Well, and we were right. I mean, people were right to be angry and want justice, right, or vengeance, maybe. But that's then the shift from, and I guess this, we can start with a kind of substantive discussion of part of the problem is that shift, we're going to get the people responsible for the 9/11 attacks to, we're going to invade Afghanistan, and then we're going to occupy Afghanistan and nation build. Talk about how that, how did that play out? And was that ever a settled strategy for certainly our war in Afghanistan?
No. I mean, we were landing the first CIA assets in Afghanistan, I think less than 2 weeks after 9/11. So it was a very rapid response. It wasn't like they sat around and developed a kind of long-term strategy for Afghanistan. It was, let's immediately deploy assets and start tracking these bastards and bring them down. That was kind of the urgent, immediate strategy. It was very simple. Find Al-Qaeda and destroy them. So the CIA went into Afghanistan with a backpack full of cash, and a hat box full of dry ice with which they intended to bring back bin Laden's head. And started. That's how the war started, with a backpack full of cash and a hat box full of dry ice. So, and from there, I think within 6 months or so, we had really degraded the Taliban's capability to prosecute war, and we had essentially destroyed all the most threatening elements of Al-Qaeda. So, you could argue within 6 months we had achieved our objective in Afghanistan. And what happened at that point is that we reached a fork in the road where we could, I think, everyone agreed at that moment we had an opportunity to create some sort of settlement that would have left us with some political restrictions and agreements to get out of Afghanistan with some sort of semblance of a government in place, and we rejected that opportunity. I
What,
think,
what went into that rejection? Because that's also, again, I think for people who lived through this period, this movie is an incredible act of recovery of memory,
yeah,
because we all kind of knew this, but then you forget it in the same way that you forget all the place names, in
yeah,
Afghanistan and Pakistan, which we were talking about 24/7, and now, where is Kandahar, or and what is Helmand province? It's
yeah,
all, it might as well be the Civil War, or World War I or something. But there was that moment which was striking to me, that you have a guy who talks, and I'm forgetting exactly who it was, but who says, we could have said to the Taliban, okay, we've degraded you. We're going to get out. We could declare victory and say, the Taliban can't harm us. We've degraded Al Qaeda, who was responsible for it. And that could have been the end of it. And why wasn't that path taken?
well, that's one of the enduring questions that will haunt us for generations. I mean, that decision not to accept that settlement in that moment had a calamitous impact on the world. And I think probably there was at that time some feeling that we weren't going to, as George Bush said, cut and run.
Right.
This that we weren't going to go into Afghanistan, essentially destroy what little government there was, or order that existed even under the Taliban, and then leave the country in shambles and go back home and declare victory. That we felt there was probably some good intention on the part of some of the American leaders to stay there and rebuild the country that had been destroyed by American bombs, and prove to the people of Afghanistan that we would be partners with them, and that we didn't have any intention of leaving them to their own devices. The country was, as we have probably long forgotten, the country had been mired in civil war since the 70s,
Right.
and we put ourselves squarely in the middle of that conflict. And I think there was probably some feeling that we owed the people of Afghanistan some support in rebuilding their country and trying to end that civil war.
And certainly the U.S., mostly in covert ways, had been involved in Afghanistan at least since the Soviet invasion in 1979, which really was a significant reason for the Soviet Union collapsing. 12 years or so later. So, I mean, we had I guess we felt some responsibility. And the Taliban was one of the most barbarous regimes around. I mean, it was like a real affront to everything. And I can remember, was it the group Feminist Majority, run by Jay Leno's wife, Mavis Leno, was the one even before 9/11, had really kind of brought to the public attention the treatment of women and girls under the Taliban. So
That's
that,
right.
when we think about beyond 9/11, why we went in, why we stayed, why we felt responsibility or a possibility of changing things, it's, there are many overlapping kind of confluence of many causes there. And it's striking that you have George Bush saying, we're not going to cut and run. This is a guy who openly campaigned against Al Gore, saying we're going to have a humble foreign policy, not like the promiscuous one under Bill Clinton. And then he starts talking about nation building.
Right. I mean, you're right that it was. I'm glad that you brought up the Taliban and its treatment of women. That was that was very present in the minds of the American public at that time. The Taliban were violating all kinds of human rights, and also were the people that were responsible for hosting and giving shelter to to Al Qaeda, the people responsible for 9/11. So there was this real kind of hatred, I suppose you could say, at that time toward the Taliban. And we can get into what the Taliban actually is. It's not, perhaps as uniform as the American public was led to believe. But certainly there were elements of the Taliban leadership that promulgated this horrendous human rights abuse in Afghanistan. So
certainly I think we would agree. I think a lot of people, knowledgeable people, would say, however horrific the Taliban may have been in many of its practices, it was not a certainly not an existential threat to the United States of America.
No, that's right. That's where we turned into this, kind of international police force where we were going to take care of the bad guys and rescue the Afghan people from the clutches of these, horrendous human rights abusers. And that was a real shift in the mission. And we did transition into this nation building effort from a more kind of strategic, tactical mission and the goal of the invasion had been accomplished more or less at that point.
Right. With the exception of killing bin Laden.
With the exception of killing bin Laden. That's right. And I think no one really thought we were done in Afghanistan until we got bin Laden, or at least identified where he was. And so there was some residual momentum to stay in Afghanistan just to make sure that we had completely covered all our bases and searching for Osama bin Laden. I mean, there's a separate discussion to have after Osama bin Laden is killed, because the war another,
we'll get to that in a little bit, because that's 2009, and we're still in the early stages of things. One thing that I found striking in the movie, particularly again remembering back, is that Dick Cheney, the vice president, is largely absent from this documentary. Bush and Rumsfeld are represented. Dick Cheney is not. Can you talk a little bit about what went into that? Because at the time, Cheney was considered by many people, including some Bush supporters, but certainly many of his antagonists, that, Bush was kind of a puppet, and that Dick Cheney was kind of calling all the shots, both in terms of the domestic policy, but especially foreign policy. Where is Dick Cheney in all of this?
It's a great question. He's in there. I mean, we have him in a couple of archival clips. We noted that too, that as we were going through the archive, Rumsfeld was often the public face of the war and provided just so much, I have to say, so much rich material. Everything he said was just drenched in this horrific irony, looking back 20 years. So I think we ended up sort of relying more on the Rumsfeld material because there was so much of it, and it was so rich, and he was so weirdly magnetic to watch. And I think it was really just following the strength of the archive material rather than making a deliberate decision to not feature Cheney as much. I mean, one of the biggest problems we had actually in the film was that there was so much coverage of the war at the beginning. We had, hundreds of hours of archive from, say, the first 5-6 years of the war. And then as the war stretched on and subsequent administrations were more deliberate about limiting access to coverage of the war when it wasn't going well, there was actually far less material that we could pull from. And so one of the biggest problems we had in the film was not making the entire thing sort of about the Bush Cheney regime, because there was so much terrific material we could have.
And weirdly, nobody knew it at the time, but like they were, when Bush leaves office, the Afghanistan War, sadly, is kind of only getting started. It's not even the halfway point, right, of American
little did we know
presence. The other thing that struck me, and again, the footage is just incredible, of Hamid Karzai, who was the leader who became the leader of Free Afghanistan. And what is stunning about that is not only you go into the corruption around him and the way that undercut and fueled both more American kind of involvement and the just killing any opportunity that this would be successful in any way that you could measure it. He actually says at various points that he's not going to let America or Western countries leave until he says so. You're going to be here as long as I need you to be here. Can you, how did that play? There's a clip with him and Bush where Bush is I hope it's going to be sooner than that. But it was stunning. You had the leader of this country basically saying no, you're going to stick around as long as I can get more dough and treasure out of you.
I too was stunned. I didn't remember any of that from the time. And I was stunned to see those clips as well. I mean, he's openly trolling the American public to their faces and saying, essentially, I am in complete control here, that you guys have pushed all your chips into my pot, and the success of this war basically lives and dies with me. He had that confidence and swagger, so he could step up to the podium and say, I'm not letting you leave until you pour billions of more dollars into this country. And it was sort of a joke in the moment, but really, I mean, it was laced with this sardonic truth. He really understood his power position. The Bush administration in particular had really put a lot of their kind of public relation muscle behind the success of the Karzai government. And so, when there were problems, I mean, when the bank collapse happened, for example, Karzai knew that he could basically force the United States to cover the losses of the bank and prop up his failing government to make it look good, because we had our success basically rested on the success of the Karzai administration. So it was sort of galling and shocking to see him stand in front of podiums. This was multiple press conferences where he would stand up and say exactly what you mentioned, that oh no, we're not letting you leave. You have to stay. Yeah, we need you. We need your money. We need your troops. We need your workers. So stick around a while.
You have many different voices, including some people from the Taliban as well as Afghans, people fighting the Taliban who were allies with the U.S., and then, various levels of U.S. Soldiers, military, forensic accountants and whatnot. There's a moment kind of early on when you have somebody talking where they're like, when we started saying, okay, we invaded there, and then we're going to go in and we're going to control the country. And then I mean, it's beautiful filmmaking where you're showing kind of the topography of Afghanistan. And the guy is saying like, oh, we think like we can control this valley. And then you realize there's another one after that, and another one after that, another one after that. It's like a map of Minecraft or something, the video game, where it just is infinite. And you realize there aren't the population centers. There isn't the kind of transportation or logistical infrastructure that normally you can go in and control. You control a country by controlling the ports or the roads or the airports. There's none of that. Do you think the Americans, did the American military go in just totally naively then? Like they had no idea of the country that they were about to go into and think that they were going to control?
I think that was part of it. I mean, it reminds me of Vietnam, where we had very little understanding of how difficult it would to actually function in this environment, this literal environment. And that shot from the helicopter, it's the man who's speaking during that scene is named Matthew Ho, and he was a former Marine, a State Department attaché. And his point is that, as you look down from the helicopter, you start to ask yourself, I mean, how much physical room do you need to stage, an insurrection or a terrorist cell? You don't need very much physical space at all. And when you look out over all these valleys, it just strikes you that the task of covering this whole country and finding all the possible spaces that these folks could be hiding out in. It was an impossible task. It could never be accomplished. And the futility of it struck him in that moment. And Afghanistan is a very, it's mountainous. It's high, has high altitude environments. It has deserts. It has, dense, areas of dense foliage. It's it's a real challenge for troops to operate in this environment. So I think we didn't quite understand. The Americans have a real can-do attitude about things like this. It's something to be commended, and also something that maybe falls under the heading of hubris.
Well, and you have Bush at one point, even in one of his press conferences, is like, everybody knows Afghanistan is the graveyard of empires, but not for us. We're gonna be the one exception.
That's right. Yeah. So there's a certain amount of hubris, a certain amount of determination, that kind of American can-do spirit, and then I think everyone agrees that there was not, to your question about whether we knew what we were getting into, there was certainly no consensus on what the objective was, what the strategy was, even how you were to measure success in Afghanistan. There was no consensus. There was no set of metrics that everyone agreed would be the way to measure how we were making or not making progress in Afghanistan.
But then you talk about it, or a number of the people say, okay, so we didn't have good metrics. So then we started saying, okay, we're going to start counting how many schools we build, how many courts we build, et cetera. And why was that, why was that a misguided way of, judging whether or not we were moving towards something like a successful conclusion or prosecution of the war?
Yeah, I think it was really just optics. I mean, I think the U.S. government knew that played well with the American public. The idea of building schools for children and for women, it is a noble objective, and it's something that I think we can all get behind. No one is going to disagree with that as an objective. The problem was it had nothing to do necessarily with how much or how little we were changing the influence of the Taliban in that country. I mean, there were far more weighty goings on in Afghanistan beyond schools and education for children and women that would determine whether or not the people in the middle of the country were going to, be more comfortable with the Taliban or with this kind of, U.S.-backed fledgling government that was being run by Karzai. So it really was kind of window dressing. The idea that we were building schools was not really in any meaningful way connected to whether or not we were successful at rebuilding the country and creating this new democracy in our image. It was just a small piece of the larger fabric of the country.
Yeah, and it seemed, I remember when Rumsfeld, who obviously, along with Cheney, had been kicking around in the Ford administration, which is like famously the least missed presidential administration of the past 70 years. But Rumsfeld reminded not just me, a lot of people of Robert McNamara, who had been LBJ's Secretary of Defense during Vietnam. Part of it is the glasses and the kind of wet look hair, he was just very, kind of corporate looking and things like that. And Rumsfeld, I mean, it seemed like there was the echo of Vietnam had a body count. We knew we were winning when more North Vietnamese soldiers were being killed than American soldiers. And then we were counting things again in Iraq. Instead of counting victory, we were counting the number of things that we were building or the number of dollars we were spending, partly to mask, as you're saying, like the fact that we didn't really have a clear objective that we could then say, okay, are we getting closer or further from that?
That's right. Yeah, there was. I think that's right. And in the example that you brought up just a second ago about, just remind me what it was. You said there was the schools and this is something
courts, dollars spent, things like that.
Exactly. The money, that was a fascinating. I had forgotten about the amount of money that was being poured into Afghanistan during those years, but we were hearing over and over again from the military leaders that we talked to for the film just how much money. I mean, we're talking, literal pallets of cash flown in on 30s, and often the success of an operation or a mission would be measured by how much money was spent or how much money was distributed to locals. And that was just not a reliable way to measure success or failure in Afghanistan.
No, well, although it's a favorite tool of government. I mean, that's one of the ways we knew COVID aid was working, is that we spent a lot of money on it. So like by definition, right? If spending $1 is good, spending $1,000 is 1,000 times better or something.
Right. Which is, why, I mean, this is something we get into in the film, when you soak a sponge, when you pour an entire lake onto a sponge, you're going to have a lot of people that get wet. The sponge can only soak up so much. And so we reached saturation point pretty quickly in Afghanistan, and all the money that was spilling over into the hands of the Taliban in particular. But throughout the country really became, you know, we complained a lot about corruption in Afghanistan and neglected our own, our own role in precipitating that corruption, and that was one of the big kind of lies that we got into in the film.
Really important part of the film happens when David McKiernan, who's the U.S. and NATO commander who was there for the beginning of the war, and then he ends up getting fired, which is very rare for a commander to be fired, during an act of war, when Barack Obama becomes president. And can you talk, because this, to me, is what is particularly chilling about our experience in Afghanistan and also in Iraq. But, the film is about Afghanistan, is that Obama seemed to campaign on the idea that he was kind of anti-war, or, he was anti-dumb wars. He was in favor of smart wars. And then he came in and he said, I'm going to win Afghanistan. Can you talk about how he gave new life to the war effort there? He ultimately upped the troop strength to its highest levels. And why didn't that work?
Well, I think, as David McKiernan said, he was the general in charge during that period, at least before he got fired. There was a belief among some leaders in the military that there wouldn't be a military solution to Afghanistan, that was going to have to be a political solution. And pouring more troops into the country wasn't going to bring us closer to that political solution. And also, I think that the surge was, as McKiernan says in the film, the surge was a sign of not of success, that we were going to win the war, but it was a sign of failure, that we were losing the war. We had to send in more troops because we weren't making any progress. And I on some level, I can understand the impulse of this new administration, and particularly Obama, who was at that time seen perhaps by some as not a strong military leader, not really a commander-in-chief type of man, that he needed to prove his mettle as a military leader and show the country that he could go in and get stuff done. And so there was probably some political momentum to bolster the war effort, to show that he was not going to be weak about what we were doing in Afghanistan. And perhaps, I think, I can't really speak to the truth of this or not. I wasn't in the room, obviously, but, you do wonder if maybe some of those generals had, pushed him a little bit to make that decision for his own good and for the good of the U.S. military and for the, for the public relations effort around the war. So that we were not going to, take our foot off the pedal and that we were going to try to get this thing done. And so sometimes, as Jeff Eggers says in the film, there's this bias toward action.
Right.
It's very hard to be, imagine coming in as the newly minted U.S. president and saying, we've lost the war and I'm withdrawing our troops. It's a really hard political maneuver to pull off and survive. And so, you don't want to be the person without a chair when the music stops. And I think that, I left him little option to push forward.
Well, it's particularly frustrating. And of course, all of this is kind of, armchair quarterbacking and whatnot. But given the fact that the U.S. did find and kill bin Laden, that again seems like a moment where you can say, okay, our mission is accomplished and we're coming home. Or it's like, let's push it. And I mean, this is, we have talked a lot in the past decade, and a little bit before, but, about the things like the deep state, the idea of a kind of permanent military industrial complex that is far more powerful than any person who happens to be running the government. But I think your film speaks to, I mean, it's not a conspiracy movie in any way, shape, or form, but that the logic, the power, and the strength of a military establishment that is probably going to be able to overwhelm the possible preference of any given president or even Congress, really.
That's right. And at that time in the war, you have to remember, I mean, there was aside from the political momentum and the political stakes, there was also a huge economic incentive for both the United States and, frankly, the Taliban to continue the war. There was, as we discussed, when we were talking earlier about Karzai, I mean, there were billions and billions of dollars pouring into Afghanistan, and there were major international corporations that were doing business in Afghanistan with powerful lobbies. And, a lot of those defense corporations employed former military leaders as advisors or board members. And so there was this kind of network of corporations that was doing a lot of business in Afghanistan. And I think, every time we investigated a story related to this, to this theme for the film, we found that whatever story we looked into always touched money in some way. I mean, money was just a huge reason for our one of the hugest reasons we found for the war persisting as long as it did.
And it's not necessarily it's a war for oil or something like that, but it's once that cash flow is started, it's really hard to stop it again, because everybody who's getting a dollar, including people where the money, I mean, you mentioned the Taliban, money being diverted, that's supposed to go to Afghan allies and ends up in the hands of Taliban. Everybody wanted the cash flow to keep going.
Everybody wanted a part of it. People were, there were Afghans who were living in squalor who became, multimillionaires and moved to Dubai. So, people were and then, you look at the defense contractors that are based around, Virginia and Washington, those areas of our country, flourished during this period. People were buying huge houses. Hotels were being erected. Those, as Matt Ho says in the film, the sick joke was that Reconstruction was failing in Afghanistan, but it was doing very well in Northern Virginia. And so, the influence of money in this campaign is something that was really sobering to see.
So McKiernan, General McKiernan, he got fired partly because he did not wrap himself in a bodyguard of lies, and it became recognized that he was not a believer in the progress narrative. He was replaced ultimately by Stanley McChrystal, who also got fired because he unfortunately talked on the record, or whatever. He talked to a Rolling Stone reporter and was bad-mouthing Joe Biden, among other people. So in a way, it's kind of nice to see the press actually having some kind of impact on something. But in many ways, this movie seems to be about the failure of the media to really be interrogating the government in real time. Do you agree with that? And what explains that? And maybe it's that first in the first flush of the Afghan war in Afghanistan, it is patriotism, it's outrage, it's a feeling like 9/11 had happened, and the war on terror seemed very terrifying. And then later, when Obama comes in, he is, most of the press corps probably voted for him. He was hope and change. He was going to do it right. He learned the lessons of Vietnam in a way that the Bush administration had not.
That's
but
right.
Really, the media really kind of sucked throughout all of this.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think that the media failed on some level to press as hard as they could. I also think that you could argue that the administrations at the time were incredibly adept at spinning, and were very good at providing the kind of answers that they knew would satisfy both the media and the American public. And so, I think it's fair to say that the press at large didn't do as much as it could or should have to press public officials on the progress made in the war. I mean, at a certain point, you're going to need someone to tell you the truth, and the question is, how do you find that person in the middle? That what we found over and over and over again was that people were so worried about their own survival, their own jobs. It was very hard to find people to speak on the record who would give you the truth. So, with David McKiernan, when General McKiernan was fired, the message, reverberated through the ranks of the military that you better you better fall in line and say what you're supposed to say, or else you're going to end up out. If it can happen to him, it can happen to anybody. So, in some ways, the press was hamstrung. I'm not trying to defend them necessarily, but I can understand the challenge of trying to get someone to speak on the record and say, this wasn't going as well as they say it is.
What about Congress? Because this, and as I was watching, I was thinking, okay, there's people like Ron Paul and maybe like Cynthia McKinney. There were a couple of people who were reliably kind of anti-war all the time, every war, every action. But did Congress fall asleep at the switch during the Afghanistan war?
That's a great question. I actually don't know. I think that's a fair question. I mean, you have to remember at that time we were still calling it the good war. I mean, there was this idea that we were going after the real bad people and doing the good work of rebuilding a nation that was in shambles. We were trying to build our democracy. We were trying to free women from these human rights abuses, give children a future. So everyone had this idea that this was, Iraq was a real quagmire and, and deceived about the weapons of mass destruction. And that was sort of the bad war. But Afghanistan was the good war where all the intentions were right. And I think, for better or worse, that messaging actually was pretty successful. And so I don't know. It's a great question. I don't know.
And McKiernan on that point though of like good wars and bad wars, he has comments where he talks about, there is no such thing as a good war. I mean, there are more successful and less successful, more humane and less humane, but like it's terrible business. What was he like in person? Just because he seemed incredibly haunted, by his experience.
That's a great word to describe him. And, for my money, he's kind of the hero of this movie. I just have tremendous respect for him because he's introspective in a way that I think is I find it really moving. I mean, for a 4-star general who spent his career in the military, whose children, went to West Point and also fought in Afghanistan, him to say that there's no such thing as a good war. I mean, every time I hear that in the movie, I feel a pit in my chest. I feel emotion inside me welling up. And I just think he is an exceptional person. And for him also to have the courage in that moment to sort of not toe the party line and to say, I don't think that there is going to be a military solution in Afghanistan. I think it's going to have to be a political solution. For him to say that and to not kind of fall into the to the repetition of this kind of we're going to win, we're making progress. That's something that is commendable, speaks to his character. In person, when I sat down with him, what I really wanted to hear him say, and what I don't think he had said very clearly publicly, was that he was fired for not speaking. He was fired for speaking the truth. And he'd been very politic up to that point and sort of just, removed himself from the conversation after he was fired. And I didn't know what to expect, but, that interview, I think, was, to me, just a showcase of courage. He acknowledges his own complicity and the spin. He certainly will never think of himself as spinning lies, but he certainly has a lot of introspection about his own role and perpetuating this sort of image of progress being made in Afghanistan. And he has, I'm sure, some degree of regret about that. But he's just a really thoughtful, curious, intellectually, rigorous guy with a lot of, courage and honesty inside of him. And I just have a lot of respect for the man.
Towards right near the very end of the of the movie, one of your voices talks about how who was a forensic accountant who went through all of the the kind of the money that was spent and where it went and where it disappeared and all that. He was saying, we said after Vietnam, we're not going to do this again. After the first Gulf War, et cetera. We're going to do it again, and we really need to learn some lessons. Do you think, or what lessons have the American people learned from the war in Afghanistan?
It was John Sopko, actually, the general for
Thank you.
Afghanistan.
Yeah, who's also, I mean, like just as somebody who makes documentaries, like the people, the voices are just spectacular throughout, and they all add something different and powerful. So, and he is certainly one of them.
Yeah, he's terrific, and another courageous kind of it was an interesting thing making the film when we first set out. This is an aside.
Yeah.
I'll circle back to the question in a second, but we really, I got into this with my claws sharpened, ready to sort of go after the bad actors and nail the perps. And along the way, we discovered people like David McKiernan and Sopko and Matthew Ho and Peter Lucier, who were all just these voices of incredible honesty and courage. And it became, we sort of pivoted the film. I discovered along the way that these people were the heart of the film. The truth tellers, not the liars, but the truth tellers were actually the people that I wanted to shine a light on. And so, and John Sopko certainly was at the forefront of that. And yes, at the end of the film, he, this is a bit of a spoiler, I suppose, but he says, let's learn some lessons.
Yeah.
And to your question, whether we've learned anything, it's probably too early to say. I would say maybe this is somewhat cynical given where we are in the world right now, but it doesn't seem like we've learned very much. I mean, we can see from conflicts raging all over the world right now, this kind of lies that we heard in Afghanistan, that we've heard in other conflicts. It's, one of the things that was really haunting about making this film is hearing over and over again how acutely aware the United States leadership was about the lessons of Vietnam. I mean, famously, anecdotally, Obama had on his nightside table, his bedside table, a book about Vietnam.
Right.
And we heard, Rumsfeld saying, I don't do quagmires.
Yeah.
And Bush saying, we're not going to fall into that same old trap. We know better now.
Right.
And what did we do? We made exactly the same missteps we made in Vietnam. So, the idea that we've somehow this time around learned lessons that we said we had learned from Vietnam and clearly didn't. It's just hard for me to imagine that history, unfortunately, is not going to repeat itself, and probably is repeating itself even as we speak.
I guess here, let me try to cheer you up a little bit, because as I was watching the movie, I was thinking, okay, and I think in broad terms, you're absolutely correct. We never learn lessons, or when we do, we learn them in order to repeat them rather than to not do them over. It's interesting when you look at polls of the American people, like the idea of long, protracted occupations. Yeah. Nobody really is pushing that anymore. It is extremely hard. Either, Republicans or Democrats, very few of them are saying, for instance, like, well, we should invade Iran. It's Trump, who is an interesting figure in this because he did broker a withdrawal plan with the Taliban. It's frustrating in many ways because he kind of left the Afghanistan government out. And we see, echoes of that happening with Ukraine, right? Conceivably, but he's, he not only brokered a deal, but then he's been, and in many ways, I'm no supporter of Trump, and he does not seem to be interested in going through Congress at all. But he does these one and done strikes rather than saying like, okay, we're gonna do a quick invasion and occupation and get out. He seems to have learned a lesson.
I guess I can't speak to that. It does. Yeah. It is. I don't know how much he's learned or not learned from American history. I'm not much of a student of American history, but it was sort of alarming to see people like Marjorie Taylor Greene being some of the loudest voices about the strikes in Iran, and about being very. There's a lot of people on the right who are very clear that we don't, that they don't, for different reasons, I think, than the left, don't want to be involved in these kind of protracted conflicts overseas.
But there is a spirit of non-interventionism that is prominent in kind of American public discourse that did not exist in the late 90s or the early 2000s.
I don't know how much of that we can attribute to Afghanistan and Vietnam. I suspect a good part of it for sure. Our memory of Afghanistan is still somewhat fresh, although it seems like the news cycle has turned over so many times every day that Afghanistan feels like, a generation ago. It's hard to believe it was only, what is it now? 5 years or so that the war ended.
Yeah, like 4 years actually, right? Because it was in 2021 is when Biden, who also, makes an appearance towards the end of this movie, or or his actions do. Yeah.
But it's already faded so far in the minds of the American public as distant history, even though it's somewhat recent history.
Oh yeah.
But I do think that everyone is really bitter still about what happened in Afghanistan. The war on terror generally is seen as a not so proud part of our history now. And so,
to steelman that, can I ask, the argument that people who support the war on terror, which I think has officially been disbanded, but, the kind of global war on terrorism that was invoked with the Patriot Act and in the early years of the Bush administration, the argument that people who support that say, yeah, it might have been messy, but we haven't had another 9/11. Is that, is that a good enough justification for the global war on terror?
I'm not sure it is. We heard that a lot. I mean, look, we haven't had an attack on U.S. soil since 9/11, so obviously we did something right. I mean, I suppose there's, I don't know that we can say definitively that because we, prosecuted this 20-year campaign in Afghanistan, we made the American homeland safer or not. I'm sure there's voices in other circles that would say, arguably, we've increased the danger to the United States. Maybe we haven't been attacked yet, but prosecuting these wars all over the world against terrorist cells maybe has incited or even created a groundswell of anti-American sentiment. You could argue back that way. So I don't know for sure that it's on its face, it seems like an interesting way to argue for the success of the war on terror, but I don't know that we can claim victory in the way that perhaps people would. Like, go ahead.
Oh, this is your third movie about Afghanistan. Can you explain, how this became kind of, very important to you as a filmmaker?
Afghanistan existed in one form or another for the majority of my adult life. It's been the single most consequential event of my, of my life as a citizen, as an adult citizen in the U.S. So I think it had a profound impact on me. As I said, I was a young man when 9/11 happened. We just had, the anniversary yesterday, the 24th anniversary of 9/11, and I suppose that war, the morality of war is something that's always fascinated me. The very first film I did was about, a war photographer.
Right. And this is a short, right?
About a South African war photographer who was, caught in that sort of classic journalist dilemma of whether it's better to document scenes of suffering and atrocity or to intervene. And so I suppose that lit some sort of, fire inside of me to investigate this idea of the morality of war. I did a film back in 2014 about a group of soldiers in Afghanistan that were accused of war crimes and desecrating corpses and horrible things like that. And so I've always, I think, been sort of drawn to this idea of good and bad in war, and what, right and wrong.
What do you think? You mentioned, as a documentarian or, as a journalist, there's a question of how do you, or do you become a kind of partisan, or do you become an activist, or do you become a part of the story? And the short film you're talking about, and I'm sorry, the name of the photographer is blown out of my head. Yeah. But he took that famous photo, right? Of a starving child. And, and it killed him. It ultimately, he could not live with, that having kind of been involved in that scenario.
Yeah.
What do you think? I mean, are journalists rightfully part of the story, and should they foreground, should they engage, and should they foreground their engagement, or should they be somehow removed from a situation?
I think I've evolved myself on that on the thinking around that. I started as a journalist working for newspapers, and when I was working for newspapers, I had a very strict line between what I was doing as a journalist and what I was seeing and witnessing as a journalist, and I felt very strongly that you should never step over that line. As I've gotten older and as I've gotten into documentary filmmaking, which I think is a different, it's not really journalism. It comes with a point of view. It allows you to be more expressive of a particular point of view. I think is the best descriptor. I've loosened my thinking around. I'm less stringent about what I think that the importance of that line, and I do think that. I don't think that it is. How do I say this? I think journalists can do both. I think they can report and they can act as human beings when they need to take care of other human beings. And I don't think those things are mutually exclusive.
Yeah. We have come a long ways. I assume you're familiar with the terrible movie from the 80s, Broadcast News, where there are all of these insanely dumb and banal, moments, crisis of conscience of whether or not you fake a tear in an interview and stuff like that. It's like we're so far beyond that. And it's like, I think journalists and documentarians, certainly just like novelists and narrative filmmakers, can have a point of view. And then, you should be fair, but being objective is probably not a good thing or is impossible in any case.
Yeah, I think we were, certainly there's this idea that journalists are engaged in a little bit of kind of window dressing when it comes to this idea of being objective, and you can never be part of the story. I think actually I made a fictional version of the Kill documentary, and actually it was interesting making that film and fictionalizing a true story. I realized there's a lot of ways to get at truth, and truth doesn't depend on whether you step over a line or help someone who needs help and thereby become part of the story. I don't think that takes away from our ability to tell the truth and tell a story that is honest and has an impact on people. And so, I feel a lot less, I feel for Kevin Carter because the moment he was doing what he thought was important as a journalist to take this picture and share it with the world.
Yeah.
But I can also empathize with the point of view that journalists need to think a lot more about their fellow human being than perhaps they did in the kind of more rigid days of the 60s, 70s, 80s, where we had this very line between journalists and participant. Now, because journalism has become sort of a partisan affair, I think we're all sort of involved in the story to one degree or another. Anyway, this idea of objectivity has become so diffuse that.
And I think as long as it's replaced, that ideal is replaced with fairness and accuracy, we'll be in good place. We'll be in a good place. I don't know that we're there. Can I ask you just kind of as we wrap up, do you have a favorite war movie or war documentary?
Certainly. Well, I can talk about some of the influences on this film. When we first set out with this film, I had the team watch Hearts and Minds, Peter Davis's film about Vietnam from 1974, which shares some thematic DNA with our film. In retrospect, some of it is not aged as well as maybe it did at the time, but it's in so many ways a remarkable film, a landmark film that won the Oscar. So that was a big influence on me. there was an incredible body of work being done. I mean, I think this is the first war that that really had, where we had the technology to viewers into the middle of really, really harrowing combat. And I remember seeing Restrepo at Sundance. And to this day, I think it's one of the most visceral, harrowing experiences I've ever had in a movie theater. I mean, that movie just absolutely shook me. And we were lucky enough to, sadly, Tim Hetherington is no longer with us, but we spoke to Sebastian Junger, and he was generous and kind enough to let us use some of the material that didn't appear in Restrepo in this film. So we were the proud beneficiaries of some of that work. And also I should mention that Dan Fung Dennis's Hell and Back Again was a landmark documentary about Afghanistan, and we also used some of his material in this film as well. So I kind of borrowed from my heroes to help give this film that kind of immersive first person point of view that is really, I think, a hallmark of this era of modern warfare, is that we're able to sort of see what it feels like to be a soldier. And so those three films.
It's an incredibly impressive accomplishment what you've done, where you can shift from first person combat footage to interviews. And I mean, and this doesn't give anything away, there were moments where I realized I'm watching soldiers that you're interviewing who were reflecting on what they did, and I was terrified you were going to pull back and we would only see their battered bodies or their ruined bodies. I mean, there's a sense of foreboding and menace throughout the movie, which is spectacular. It's a real achievement, I think. Can I ask, as a final question? Somebody at one point in the movie says, like, Americans think they're done with history, but history isn't done with us. What is, if there's a single message or thought that you think you want viewers to kind of walk away with, what is it?
Don't believe what they tell you. I mean, I think that's the message of the film, is that, look, I mean, we all knew that we were not being told the whole truth about Afghanistan, even as the war was still going on. It was another thing when, Craig Whitlock at the Washington Post actually sued the government and got his hands on documents that proved it. I mean, having the receipts, reading this material, reading interviews with people who knew that the war couldn't succeed, even as they were pumping the American Congress.
And I'm sorry to interrupt you, but you talk about redoing Vietnam. I mean, that's the whole point of the Pentagon Papers, right? The Defense Department knew they had commissioned a study of Vietnam that showed there's no way we were going to win this in the early stages of the war. And that exact scenario was replicated in Afghanistan.
It's eerie. Yeah. It's almost, stranger than fiction. You can't believe the parallels. Unfortunately, the message is that, that we are being lied to about U.S. involvement in foreign campaigns over and over and over again. And we need to be more skeptical, healthily skeptical. We need to press our leadership for more truthful answers. We need to demand that. I think, to our earlier discussion about the press can push more strongly our leaders to prove, to back up their assertions that we're succeeding. I mean, we saw just recently, interestingly, with the bombing in Iran, that there was, and I think, some really healthy questions about whether or not the bombing was as successful as U.S. leadership was claiming. And I think, I think there were a lot of angry remarks. I remember seeing some, I guess Pete Hegseth and others angrily lashing out at the press for asking those questions. Well, that's what the press is supposed to do. The press is supposed to demand those kinds of answers. And there's nothing unpatriotic about asking for the truth. And I think maybe that's a better message for the film. There's nothing unpatriotic about asking for the truth. We all demand it. We're all paying with we're sending our sons and daughters into, a dangerous foreign conflict. We're committing billions of tax dollars and resources to these conflicts. We deserve the truth, and we should demand it from our leaders.
All right, we're going to end on that note. Dan Krauss, the movie is Bodyguard of Lies. Thanks so much for talking to Reason.
It was great. Thanks for having me.